Shalom and welcome to Shmuel's Views Toward Observant Judaism. Today we're going to take a look at Isaiah chapter 53. We're going to do so for two reasons. Number one is to get an understanding of the Hebrew text so that we can refute missionary attempts to misuse this chapter, Isaiah chapter 53, in an inappropriate manner to support their false claim that Jesus is Mashiach, or the Messiah. The second reason is because there is, within certain circles, especially within Christianity, there is this ongoing tale, if you will, what they call today misinformation, concerning Isaiah chapter 53, saying that we Jews are afraid to read that chapter because it points to Jesus. Well, I'm here to definitely refute that as well. It's obvious that I'm sure the leadership within the Christian church knows this, but the regular everyday folk do not understand that when in our synagogues on Shabbat, we read certain Haftorah or passages from the prophets and other writings that coincide with whatever the weekly parsha or the weekly section of the Torah is. Within the Haftorah reading, it coincides with the reading that we do each week in the Torah. And there is simply nothing that coincides with Isaiah 53. There are a lot of places in the prophets that are not read because they simply do not coincide with the parsha for that week. So let's dispel that misinformation right away, shall we? We read Isaiah 53. We simply just don't read it during our Torah and Haftorah portions within the synagogue. But trust me, we study and read all the prophets, all the chapters, and all the verses. So let's move on now to Isaiah chapter 53. This is a little long-winded, so hang in there because we cover a lot of ground, but it's very, very important ground to cover. And any good or even fair student of Bible interpretation, versed in the original language of the Torah, of the Tanakh, understands that in order to come to the intended meaning of any particular author of Holy Writ, verses, sections, or passages, they can only be properly understood when they are viewed in the context of Adonai's revelation as a whole, and within the framework of the verses that come before and after any particular verse. With that firmly in mind, therefore, to better understand Isaiah chapter 53, we must look at the setting in which it is situated. And before we go any further, I want to encourage you to hit the subscribe button, to hit the notification bell so you can be notified when new videos get posted, and hit that like button, that thumbs up button, if you would. And also, come and drop by and visit our website, Shmuel's Views Toward Observant Judaism. The link to that website will be posted below in the description of this video. Now, in the chapters preceding chapter 52 of Isaiah, Israel's exile is being predicted and explained by Hashem through the prophet Isaiah. By the time we reach chapters 52 through 54, we find ourselves in the fourth and last of what has been hermeneutically titled the servant songs of Isaiah, in which Hashem is delivering a message of loving consolation to his beloved people, telling them of their future restoration. He indicates that among the nations, Israel, his servant, will be raised by Hashem to a place of prominence. Adonai will at last vindicate Israel because of the nations that oppressed him and forced him into exile. Chapter 54 onward continues with the future awaiting the Jewish people. Now, those who study the Jewish scriptures should know that there were no chapters and no verse divisions in the Hebrew scrolls, in the Hebrew Bible. What is now termed chapter 53 is really a continuation of a conversation begun in what has become known as chapter 52, verse 13, where it says, "Behold, my servant shall prosper. He shall be exalted and extolled and be very high. Just as many were astonished at you, saying, Surely his visage is too marred to be that of a man, and his form to be that of the sons of men. So shall he startle many nations. Kings will shut their mouths for that which had not been told to them. They shall see, and that which they had not heard, they shall perceive." At this juncture, we have to ask ourselves several questions, 5 to be exact. Who is this servant? And who are the nations? Who are these kings? Who is speaking in verses 13 and 15, and then who interjects in verse 14? Israel, in the singular collective tense, is always referred to by Hashem throughout Isaiah's writings preceding chapter 53 as, quote, the servant. It is unsound and totally irrational to think that Hashem would suddenly change his meaning of Israel or Jacob in chapter 53 to mean anyone else other than that same servant that was being referred to in all those preceding chapters. "But you are my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the descendant of Abraham, my friend. You whom I have taken from the ends of the earth and called from its farthest regions. And I said to you, you are my servant. I have chosen you and have not cast you away. Fear not, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Yes, I will help you. And I will uphold you with my righteous right hand or my righteous right arm." Isaiah 41, 8 through 10. "Yet now hear, O Jacob, my servant, and Israel, whom I have chosen. Thus says Adonai, that made you and formed you from the womb, who will help you. Fear not, O Jacob, my servant, and you, Yeshurun, whom I have chosen." Isaiah 44, 1 through 2. "For Jacob, my servant's sake, and Israel, my elect, I have even called you by your name." Isaiah 45, 4. "Adonai has redeemed his servant, Jacob." Isaiah 48, 20. "You are my servant, Israel, in whom I will be glorified." Isaiah 49, 3. The nations in chapter 53 here, the nations are all the Gentile nations of the world, and the kings are the governments and rulers of those nations. The speaker in verses 13 and 15 is Hashem. The speakers in verse 14 and in chapters 53 verses 1 through 11 and a half are the kings or leaders and rulers of the Gentile nations. The prophet picks up the dialogue in the last half of chapter 53, verse 11, and continues on into chapter 54. This is the contextual setting of the verses found in Isaiah chapter 53. Please note other references to Israel as Adonai's servant, who has been regarded by the nations as having been cast out and forsaken by Hashem. This notion is the Gentile nation's perception, as in chapters 53 of Isaiah, not Hashem's reality. However, even in chastisement of Israel, Adonai never abandons or casts out his servant Jacob, Israel. See, if you will, Jeremiah chapter 30, verses 10 through 21, where it speaks extensively of this. In Isaiah chapter 53, it is abundantly clear that the nations and their rulers are startled and speechless over what happens to Jacob, or Israel, the servant of Adonai. They are so amazed that they exclaim, "Who could possibly believe our report?" Isaiah 53, 1. This astonishment and shame experienced by the nations as they watch Hashem restore Israel, his servant, to prominence is unparalleled in the other prophets, is paralleled in the other prophets as well. For example, see Micah chapter 7, verses 12 through 20. Isaiah 53:1 speaks of the arm of the Lord. This always refers to Israel's physical redemption from the oppression of the nations. See Isaiah 58:7 through 12. The great trials which your eyes saw, and the signs and the wonders and the mighty hand, and the stretched out arm whereby Adonai your God brought you out. Deuteronomy 7:19. Also, how you did drive out nations with your hand, and did plant them, how you battered the peoples and cast them out. For they did not get the land in possession by their own sword, nor did their own arm save them. But your right hand, and your arm, and the light of your countenance, because you favorably accepted them. Talking about Israel. Psalms 44:3 through 4. Israel, as Adonai's servant and chosen people, have a long history of being despised and rejected of men. You make us the butt of our neighbors, the scorn and derision of those around us. You make us a byword among the nations, a laughingstock among the peoples. Psalm 44:14 through 15. Whereas you were forsaken and hated, so that no man went through you, I will make you an eternal excellency, a joy of many nations. Isaiah 60:15. And the pains of adversity endured by Israel, Adonai's servant, some self-inflicted, but most by the nations, is frequently compared by Hashem to diseases, sickness, and illness. See Isaiah 1:5 through 7, 53:3, Jeremiah 10:17 through 20. Remembering to keep in mind that the speakers in chapter 53 of Isaiah are the ruling kings of the Gentile nations, the strict translation from the Hebrew text should read like this: For he was wounded because of our transgressions, he was bruised because of our iniquities. The Hebrew word for because may be rendered as he was wounded from our transgressions. He was crushed from our iniquities. The word for in place of because or from is a later Christianized editing of the Hebrew text in order to make it best fit the Pauline narrative. There are instances where Israel, the servant of Adonai, is likened to sheep ready to be slaughtered. You make us to turn back from the enemy, and they who hate us take plunder for themselves. For he knows the secret of the heart. But for your sake we are killed all day long. We are reckoned as sheep for the slaughter. Psalm 44:11 and 22. In chapter 53, verse 8 of Isaiah, we see another example of Christian editing and why it is so important to know the Hebrew text and language. The Christianized version reads this way: He was taken from prison and judgment, and who will declare his generation? And by the way, most Christian translations presume, so they capitalize the his. In Hebrew, there is no such rendering or use of capitalization and punctuation, etc. It is only done sparingly now in our Jewish Bible translations to render a proper understanding of the divine communicating and not a mere mortal. The correct and original Hebrew text states, by oppressive judgment he was taken away, and of his generation who considered. Of utmost importance in verses 8 and 9 is the prophet's use of the word la'umah. This word is a beacon of light, as it attests to the fact that the servant spoken of is not an individual single he, but the collective them, referring to the single collective servant, Israel. Another example of this Hebrew term can be found in Psalm 99:7. This changes the meaning significantly from the forced intended meaning of the Christian editors. In verse 10, which states, he shall see his seed, the Hebrew word here for seed is zerah, which refers to the physical descendants and offspring created through the natural act of sexual intercourse. It has no spiritual connotation anywhere throughout the Jewish scriptures. The rest of verse 10 is self-explanatory. Hashem created his servant, Israel, over 4,000 years ago, beginning with Avraham Avinu, and he continues to be with his servant in spite of the world's hatred of Israel, their attempts to destroy him or assimilate him. Hashem has and will continue to prolong his days as he promised. In chapter 53, verse 11 of Isaiah, once you get past the Christian editors and to the Hebrew text, we find this: with his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will cause many to be just. Note, he will not, quote, justify the many as the Christian editors proclaim. How does this verse relate to Israel? Well, Adonai's appointed mission for his people has always been to serve as a light to the nations. Even when we fail by disobedience or as a result of Gentile nations' refusal to heed, this is nevertheless still Hashem's ordained mission for his people. Our sages of blessed memory called it tikkun olam, healing or repairing the world. Isaiah chapter 53, verse 12 is also self-explanatory in light of Israel being Adonai's servant. The Jewish people, as the collective Israel and servant of the Almighty, and by the very nature of his call on our lives, are righteously carrying upon themselves the sins of the nations. And the collective faithful Israel shall be rewarded with prosperity, strength, and a portion of the spoils. Why? Because as a people, we continue to pour out our soul to death and are numbered with the transgressors. Now, this is the Jewish view of Isaiah chapter 53, as it is written in the original Hebrew. It stands on the firm foundation stones of sound doctrine, knowledge of biblical Hebrew, contextual evidence, scriptural reference correlation, and thorough exegesis. Beloved, the Jewish Bible in its Hebrew text stands on its own accord. The mistake the Christian editors made was to only edit their translations while leaving the Hebrew text unadulterated. Thankfully, for our sakes, Hashem would not permit his word to be altered from its original language and state, giving us a sure foothold on the foundation of his eternal truth. Baruch Hashem. We hope to see you again in the future when we upload a new video, which should be coming in a bit. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Leave comments below if you have anything you would like to ask or add. Interaction is very good. First of all, it helps the algorithm and helps get this out to other people as well. But I really do want to hear from you. I'd love to hear your comments. You can place them down below here in the comments section. And so I look forward to hearing from you. Drop by our website. And until next time, Baruch Hashem.